And it's now my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Patrick Lyons. Patrick.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me back there? Doing all right? Okay. Well, Kanishka and Point of Pines Pueblo have much in common. First, both were the foci of U of A field schools. Second, they are two of only 5 large, late pre-Hispanic pueblos in the Arizona mountains. Grasshopper, of course, was the center of the U of A field school and is also one of these 5. Third, collections from Kanishka and Point of Pines Pueblo have been the subject of continuing research as new questions have arisen and as old questions have been revisited using new analytical techniques. Today, I'll briefly highlight recent and ongoing research using the collections from Kanishka and Point of Pines, demonstrating the rich and enduring value of the objects and associated records generated by U of A field schools and curated by the Arizona State Museum. I'll start with the earlier of the 2 projects, the field school at Kanishka. First, I'll do a quick orientation here for folks. Not that most of you need it, but I'll be talking about, of course, Kanishka, Point of Pines. The Kayenta region will loom large in my discussion. And then also I'll be talking about the Silver Creek area where we will find Pine Needle. And of course, the Silver Creek region was the focus of another U of A field school directed by Barbara Mills between 1993 and 2004. So first, Kanishka. It has tiny little pots. In 1931, Byron Cummings, then director of the Arizona State Museum and head of the U of A Department of Archaeology, broke ground at Kanishka, a pueblo of nearly 700 rooms occupied about AD 1275 to 1400. Work at the site under Cummings slowed after 1939, but continued until 1944. Cummings' students, James Schaefer and Margaret Murray Schaefer, conducted excavations at Kanishka between 1946 and 1950 in their roles as Bureau of Indian Affairs curators of the site and its museum. Cummings' work during the summers of 1934 through 1937 was under the auspices of the U of A Field School. Cummings' efforts overall resulted in the excavation of some 240 rooms and the reconstruction of about 140. U of A Field School participants can be credited with the excavation of about 100 of those rooms. Unfortunately, the amount of reporting and the level of detailed documentation associated with this work was thin, even by the standards of the 1930s. The key contributor to the literature on Kanishka was Gordon Cordis Baldwin, who served as assistant director of ASM and later became a National Park Service regional archaeologist. Baldwin's 1934 U of A master's thesis reported the results of Cummings' 1931 to 1933 pre-U of A field school excavations at Kanishka. Baldwin later wrote 2 American Antiquity articles and a Kiva article on the site and its collections. He also contributed an article on Southwestern lore naming and describing Kanishka polychrome. Data about the sites and its collections were also featured in Baldwin's 1941 USC doctoral dissertation. Cummings' published contributions on Kanishka were limited, unfortunately, to a short Kiva article and his 1940 monograph. The latter, of course, has been criticized for its shortcomings. Indeed, John Welch in 2013 referred to Kanishka as, quote, the site nobody really knows, and observed that, quote, it is among the most extensively excavated, rebuilt, and visited, yet least analyzed or published sites in the Southwest, end quote. Although many have returned to the site's collections to include specimens and larger studies, usually focused on ceramics, in most cases, knowledge about Kanishka itself was not advanced, and comparison of the site with its contemporaries was not achieved. In seeking to remedy that situation, Welch initiated a study of the documentary record of the site and the history of research and management efforts there, resulting in a 2007 special issue of the Journal of the Southwest. He also spearheaded production of a 2013 ASM Archaeological Series volume designed mainly to bring together results of recent research efforts by a number of investigators who've been working separately on Kanishka collections. Welch contributed edited and annotated versions of the Schaefer's previously unpublished reports on excavations at the site. Charles Riggs synthesized what is known about the site's architecture and placed it in comparative context with the other large late pueblos of the Arizona mountains. And 2 ceramic studies were included, one by Daniela Triadon and one by me. Triadon conducted a sourcing study employing instrumental neutron activation analysis. She used 143 specimens from Kanishka and incorporated her results into a regional database with colleagues Andrew Duff and Barbara Mills. This larger set of samples numbered 772. Triadon was able to establish that the light-paced White Mountain redware at Kanishka was made in the Silver Creek drainage, that Kanishka red was locally produced, and that Kanishka polychrome was not actually made at Kanishka. All available evidence led her to conclude that Kanishka polychrome was in fact made in the Silver Creek drainage by the same potters who produced 4 Mile polychrome. Triadon also examined the distribution of whole and reconstructible vessels on room floors and roofs and in burials. She found that Kanishka red bowls were, by far, the most common serving vessels recovered from late room floors at the site. She suggests that Kanishka red, made by locals at the site, may have been a substitute for 4 Mile polychrome, mostly made in the Silver Creek area. This is similar, she notes, to the situation at Grasshopper, where locally produced Grasshopper polychrome is a substitute for 4 Mile polychrome. She considers a number of hypotheses regarding the social importance of redware, serving bowls, at sites of this period, including possible ritual associations with implications for the integration of immigrants. Beginning in 2008, I began to assemble all available data on Kanishka whole and reconstructible vessels, and eventually located 579 specimens in ASM's collections. In addition, using Cummings' 1940 report, Cummings-era master's theses, catalog records, and the databases of other museums to which ASM had lent Kanishka materials, I was able to identify another 48 vessels from the site not present at ASM. Photographs and/or catalog records were sufficient for use in classifying 45 of those to the wear level and most to type level. In the end, I had a sample of 624 vessels to work with, as well as 36 boxes of bulk sherds and nearly 200 non-vessel ceramic objects. I was able to refine the chronology of the site somewhat and to place Kanishka in a regional context based on the presence of newly defined Roosevelt redware types and abundant evidence of the presence of Kayenta immigrants. Here are some examples of those late Roosevelt redware types. Cliff polychrome here, White River polychrome. The name Kanishka polychrome was taken, and 9 Mile polychrome. And here's another one, Los Muertos polychrome. Now, regional context here is important when you take a look at the distribution of these late Roosevelt redware types. Many of the late types in Roosevelt redware have smaller spatial distributions than the overall distribution associated with Hilo polychrome and Tonto polychrome. So you can see Phoenix polychrome has a more restricted distribution, 9 Mile polychrome has a more restricted distribution, but more importantly, we see that at the end of the Roosevelt redware sequence, it breaks apart into an eastern subtradition and a western subtradition. And it's very interesting that Kanishka is actually part of the western tradition, whereas Point of Pines is part of the eastern tradition. Evidence of Kayenta immigrants at Kanishka includes perforated plates and babe and cradle figurines. Some were made of the same paste identified by Triadon as local, and others appear, based on temper and clay characteristics, to have been brought to the site from the Kayenta region. Perforated plates are especially valuable in identifying Kayenta immigrant enclaves. And here you can see where Kanishka lies in reference to the known distribution of sites with perforated plates. That's what this density distribution is. This is about 200 sites in the Southwest that have perforated plates. Kanishka also yielded Tucson whiteware vessels, as well as Maverick Mountain Series vessels. The latter, of course, represent Kayenta pottery produced outside of the Kayenta region using raw materials local to central and southern Arizona and west central New Mexico. Most recently, Kanishka ceramics have been featured in a study that documented the presence of cacao at the site. The positive sample from Kanishka came from a 4-mile polychrome flower pot shaped vessel like these. Shifting gears now, I'll finish up by talking about Point of Pines. At the Point of Pines Field School, between 1946 and 1960, more than 30 sites were dug to some degree, from testing to complete excavation. Many of these sites are well known because the results of the field work in almost all cases were written up and disseminated through published reports, as well as master's theses and doctoral dissertations. Alas, the results of work at Point of Pines Pueblo, the largest and longest occupied site in the Point of Pines region, were never fully analyzed or reported. One small but very significant publication focused on Point of Pines Pueblo did come out of the field school. Howery's 1958 6-page treatment of the Maverick Mountain Phase Kayenta immigrant enclave at the site. This miniature classic of southwestern archaeology presented rigorous criteria for evaluating claims regarding ancient migrations, and it also established the Point of Pines case study as the gold standard, the best documented example of pre-Hispanic population movement in the U.S. Southwest. Among other things, Howery's evidence included painted pottery identical to that made in the Kayenta region and presumably brought to Point of Pines by the immigrants, apparently locally produced versions of Kayenta pottery types, the Maverick Mountain series, and a D-shaped kiva. The Maverick Mountain Phase rune block, this blue blob here, is the name given to the part of the site where Kayenta pottery was concentrated, and that part of the site was intentionally burned. Howery interpreted this fact and others to mean that local groups had set fire to this part of the site and run the immigrants off. He interpreted the Great Wall that later encircled the site as a feature that was designed to deter reprisals. Beginning in the 1990s, when migration again became a respectable focus of inquiry by archaeologists, Point of Pines collections began to take center stage in discussions regarding how best to detect the presence of ancient immigrants and how to examine relationships between locals and immigrants. 3 key findings have emerged from this work. First, what happened at Point of Pines is considerably more complex than the story we get from Howery's 1958 article. Second, Point of Pines wasn't the only enclave of Kayenta immigrants in the southern U.S. Southwest. And third, Point of Pines Pueblo has much to tell us about the relationship between Kayenta immigrants and the origin and spread of Roosevelt redware, or Salado polychrome pottery. Although each of these is a fascinating topic of discussion, given time constraints, I will focus on 2 key studies that suggest the Kayenta immigrants were not indeed run off, and I will conclude by briefly reporting on my own work with materials from Point of Pines Pueblo. Jenny Adams' 1994 doctoral dissertation examined groundstone technology at Point of Pines through the entire pre-Hispanic sequence. Interestingly, she found that northern types of manos and metates, mealing bins, and other kinds of tools introduced by the Kayenta immigrants during the Maverick Mountain phase in the late AD 1200s persisted into the AD 1400s during the Point of Pines phase. So, these mealing bins and manos and metates are from the Point of Pines phase, and this is when we typically think of the people coming in as immigrants and maybe being run out by the fire. So needless to say, this is a little counterintuitive given the usual way that we approach the evidence of Point of Pines. In 2008, Theresa Rodriguez completed a dissertation project for which she examined more than 500 human burials from the Point of Pines region, dating between AD 400 and 1450. She had expected that she might find skeletal evidence of violence against the Kayenta immigrants. Instead, she found that such traces did not increase with the influx of newcomers. And through all periods, evidence of violence was infrequent, and generally, injuries were non-lethal. In addition, she found that immigrants were identifiable based on burial treatment, that is, flexed as opposed to extended inhumation, and sometimes cradleboard-induced cranial deformation associated with northern groups. Her data indicate that Kayenta immigrants were present in the region in small numbers as much as 100 years before the major influx during the late 1200s. Adding evidence to the conclusion that the Kayenta immigrants were not run off by the fire, she documented the fact that the immigrant burial tradition persisted through the 1300s and into the mid-1400s when the region was depopulated. Furthermore, her data show that the burials of 54 Kayenta people at Point of Pines Pueblo, indicated here in these clusters, and again, this does not represent just 18 burials. This might be 50 or 60 burials or more total here. This might be 100 burials here. This is just the number of Kayenta burials in that particular part of the site. So as you can see, the burials of those 54 Kayenta immigrants were not segregated from those of locals. They seem to have integrated in the community quite well. Point of Pines Pueblo and its collections have been a major research focus for me since 2012 when I organized an ASM summer camp for adults. The focus was to begin getting a handle on what could be learned from the collection. I enlisted ASM members, volunteers, and graduate students in what has turned out to be a Herculean effort, reorganizing the Point of Pines Pueblo ceramics collection. During the 1980s, a researcher physically reorganized some 300 boxes of potsherds according to his conception of pottery types. Luckily, more than 90% of the sherds were stamped with their find locations or proveniences, and after more than 3 years of sorting, we are finally in a position to examine the pottery level by level and room by room. My crew and I have also been recording information on the more than 750 whole or reconstructible vessels from the site, taking digital photos, updating databases, and digitizing catalog cards from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. In the process of reorganizing the potsherds, we relocated, believe it or not, some 200 additional vessels that are either entirely or partially reconstructible. Talk about an embarrassment of riches. From a research standpoint, we are most interested in exploring and better documenting the relationship between Kayenta immigrants and Salado pottery, interaction between locals and immigrants, and what happened before and after the fire. I've been exploring evidence suggesting that the Kayenta immigrants at Point of Pines were actively trying to fit in with their local host population. The best indicator of this seen thus far is the fact that they added white painted decoration to the exteriors of their bowls, decoration that is superficially similar to that characteristic of the exteriors of the pottery made and used by the local groups. From a collections management standpoint, we have two goals for the materials from Point of Pines Pueblo. First, we want to leave the collection in the best condition and with the best documentation possible as we curate them in perpetuity so that future researchers can ask old questions in new ways and ask questions we have not yet thought to ask. Second, we have been and will continue to search for and segregate all funerary objects in the collections so that they can be repatriated pursuant to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. In the process of our work, I've been having all painted funerary vessels illustrated for documentary purposes, and this one is not a funerary object. This is one of the burned decorated vessels that I had illustrated. And the reason for that, of course, is that an artist can capture decorative information that's been obscured by the fire damage. And so, there's some more examples. We've got that one, and some more examples. And with that, I will just acknowledge the fine ASM members and volunteers and graduate students who have helped with actually the Kanishka collection study and also with the Point of Pines collection studies that were talked about today. And I'd like to particularly point out the efforts of Don Burgess, Marilyn Marshall, and Jay Smith. So thank you.